Okay, I see that almost everybody has trickled in. So why don't we begin? Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Daniel Reed, and I am the Education Coordinator at the Holocaust Memorial Miami Beach. And I want to thank you all for joining us virtually this afternoon for an event for Holocaust Education Week, as well as the Miami Beach JCC Lunch and Learn program. So we have with us a very special guest. Her name is Helen Fremont, and a couple more words about her in a minute. She's going to be talking about her memoir, The Escape Artist. And just a few words about Holocaust Education Week. I'm sure most of you know it's an educational and cultural program that the Memorial conducts throughout the year, of course this year virtually. And in normal times, the Memorial hosts more than 100,000 people, including 10,000 students per year. So whether in person or virtually such as today, the Memorial dedicates itself to teaching adults and the next generation, the youth of today, to examine their own hearts, to learn the lessons of what is right, and to stand up against bigotry, racism, and anti-Semitism. So once normal life resumes, and I'm sure we're all going to be going out a lot once normal life resumes, I encourage you to visit the Memorial and experience the power of the place itself. And I'm sure the Miami Beach JCC would like to see a return to normal as well, and a return to a lot of their in-person programming also. So hopefully someday we will. It's a wonderful facility. So before we do begin, I just want to highlight a couple more programs that we do have this week for Holocaust Education Week. So tomorrow we have two programs. At 1 p.m., we have a virtual tour of the Anne Frank House. That's going to be led by two educators from that institution, which is going to be fascinating. And then at 3 p.m., we do have a very special presentation by a professional photographer named Silvio Friedman, who's visited Poland and the concentration camps multiple times, and will be giving us, through his photographer's lens, an interpretation of the Holocaust and the camps in Poland. And we're going to finish off on Friday morning at 9:30 with our very own Dr. Miriam Klein Kassenoff, who's going to be telling her story of how her and her family escaped from Nazi-occupied Europe during World War II and made their way to freedom. So I encourage you all to sign up for these programs. All of them, we still have lots of room, and of course we're virtual. So we hope that you will join us for these remaining programs. So on behalf of the Holocaust Memorial and the Florida Department of Education, I want to thank you all for joining us, and a special thanks to Karen Sepsenwall and Paul Frischman from the Miami Beach JCC. As I said, this is part of their Lunch and Learn program. So we are looking forward to the next hour. And this finally brings me to introduce our special guest, Helen Fremont. She is a lawyer and award-winning author. Her latest memoir, The Escape Artist, which we're going to hear about, is a New York Times Editor's Book Choice Award. And she's taught in multiple universities. And a lot of her writing, both fiction and nonfiction, has appeared in multiple publications, including the Harvard Review and Lilith. So I look forward to encourage you all to read some of her other work, and I'm sure this will be a great inspiration for us all. I do want to take a moment before we turn the floor over to introduce who's going to be interviewing her. Dr. Miriam Klein Kassenoff is the chairperson of the Holocaust Memorial Miami Beach Education Committee, and she is the Holocaust Curriculum Director for the Miami-Dade Public School System. Now, there's a lot more that can be said in introducing both Helen and Miriam, but I think the best thing to do is let the program begin. And Miriam, the virtual podium is yours.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you, and welcome, everybody. I see we have almost 120 people on today, and that's wonderful. I want to thank Danny, and a shout out to Sharon Horowitz, the Executive Director of the Holocaust Memorial, and to Danny Reed, who I have the honor and privilege of working with as Education Chair of the Memorial for the past 25 years. And this year, they are to be lauded for an exceptionally outstanding Holocaust Education Week program. I also want to send a kiss and a hug to my dear friend Karen Stephenwall, who is the director of the Adult Cultural Arts Program at the JCC. We work together very closely. When I'm not doing my Holocaust work, I am hiding out at the JCC on Wednesdays, where I chair our JCCU and our Lunch and Learn series. So I'm so honored and I feel so privileged and blessed that I can work with all these wonderful people. And now I have someone new to add to my circle of friendships, my dear new friend, Helen Fremont. So, Helen, I read your book and I was emotional roller coaster. I was up, I was down, I was here, I was there. And I'd like to begin our conversation with you with a quote from Elie Wiesel.
Mm.
The ashes of Auschwitz are everywhere.
Mm.
And some of those ashes have landed on those of us who are child survivors, hidden children, second generation, as you are, third generation, or what we sometimes call 2G and 3G, meaning children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. Those ashes have formed what we call, in psychological terms, transmitted trauma. Now, what is transmitted trauma? It takes form in many ways, whether they be nightmares at night, how our interrelationships are with our husbands, wives, community, work, friends, and most important, with our immediate families, with our parents, our brothers, and our sisters. This I know well. And that's where I want to begin this conversation with you today. Helen, you were raised as a Roman Catholic, and it wasn't until you were an adult practicing law in Boston that you discovered that you were not at all Roman Catholic, that your parents were Jewish, that they were Holocaust survivors, and they were living and had you lived an invented life. Not even their names were their own. And so you delved into those secrets that held your family in a bond of silence. So my first question for discussion, since I am a very chronological person, I like to see the movie from beginning to end. Tell us first, where did you grow up? Who was in your immediate family? Identify them. Who you thought your parents were, and describe those early years. And in your description in the book, you talk about your dad building this big, beautiful home in upstate Schenectady, New York, isolated. And I thought that has to mean something. So how about if you start there, Helen?
Well, thanks, Miriam. It's a treat to be here. Thank you all for inviting me. And yes, I grew up in upstate New York, and my immediate family was my entire family, as far as I knew. I mean, basically, we were a tight-knit nuclear family of 4 with a capital N. I mean, there was just mother, father, and my older sister, who's 3 years older than I am. And that's it. I mean, we knew that our parents were from Eastern Europe, and they were very vague about even where they were from. I mean, if they had accents, so whenever we went, say, to the grocery store, wherever, as soon as my mother opened her mouth or my father opened the mouth, people would say, "Oh, where are you from?" And it was never a simple, "We're from a certain country." It was always, "Well, we're from a part of Europe it's Eastern Europe." And if somebody said, "Oh, are you from Poland?" my mother would deny it and say, "No, we're not Polish." So I knew from a very early age that it was complicated where they came from, and that I couldn't hear their accents. My sister and I, being their children, we just grew up. That was what mom and dad sounded like. I could never hear their accents. But we grew up in this isolated, sort of in the middle of nowhere. The house was purposefully situated sort of in the middle of woods. We had no neighbors. We were in, at that time, it was probably about 10 miles outside of the Tri-City area of upstate New York, Albany, Schenectady, Troy. And all we knew about our parents, well, we knew that my mother had one older sister who lived in Rome, in Italy, that we didn't get to see her except every once in maybe 4 or 5 years. And we just knew that our parents had survived the war. They had come out, everybody else had been killed in bombs, we were told, and that the past was a taboo subject. You just did not ever talk about it. It was so emotionally fraught that my sister and I didn't even know, never mind that there existed grandparents of ours, we didn't even know what their names were. And when I was a little kid and said, "Oh, what happened to your mom?" my mother just, sort of burst into tears and said, "Oh, they died in a bomb." And that was it. We just didn't talk about it. And when I was growing up, really, everybody else I knew in school had aunts and uncles and cousins and this and that, and we didn't. So it was clear that we were different. And it was also emphasized, and I'm sure you recognize this, Miriam, and probably anybody who is a child survivor or second or third generation, what our parents instilled in us is all that matters is education. You get an education, and that's the only thing they can't take away from you. And it was never, specified who they are, but it was always, from a little kid, like going to elementary school, that was all that mattered in the world. So that's it.
How was it that, there was the cone of silence in many families? Either our parents talked about it constantly, or they didn't talk about it at all. Let's go back to some details. How is it that you ended up isolated in upstate New York? Your dad had he was a professional. Tell us about who your dad was, and why do you think he built this home in the woods?
Well, my dad was a physician, and he actually lost his 20s and 30s in Siberian concentration camps and labor camps. So he had actually become a physician before the war, and it took him many years to get his American license. And he started out as a country doctor in an even more remote, tiny little village, really on the Canadian border, when my parents, when he first got his American license, and that was in 1954. And my mother could not stand being marooned in this tiny little nowheresville. And so it was, I think, I was born 3 years later. She insisted that they move to some place that at least there was some culture, some city. She was a city girl all her life, and missed New York City, which is where they first immigrated when they came from Europe. So it was kind of a compromise. I later learned that they had relatives I never knew existed, but who were in the Syracuse area, and they specifically did not go to any area where they had relatives. And they went to this Schenectady area, and where they knew no one. And my mother was really the one who picked out this location and this house, which was a wacko kind of Frank Lloyd Wright knockoff, nothing traditional about it, nothing that would resemble anything that reminded them of their own homes. So it was a completely, life starts from here and we go forward.
So here you are living in this upstate city of New York, isolated in the woods. Your father is a doctor, an academic, and your mother is a housewife, culturally connected to clubs and organizations. And the family myth is that what? That
Well,
you are?
we were raised Catholic, although really kind of surface Catholics. I mean, we really didn't know much at all about Catholicism. And my father even, I think he used his cover as a doctor that on Sunday mornings he had to go to the hospital and do his hospital rounds. So he didn't even bother going to church. My mother took us to church, to a Catholic church, but we always tiptoed out of church. We always sat in the very, very last pew. So, the last row, we would come in late, we'd sit in the last row, and then we would tiptoe out before communion. And my mother always told us, well, it's not an important part of mass. And we never did that in Poland or back home. So I grew up with like a very poor understanding of Catholicism. And I also got a very mixed message about Catholicism because my mother never wanted me to go to confession. I mean, she had abhorred the tradition of confession because she said it was just a Catholic institution that enabled Catholics to commit atrocities throughout history with a clear conscience. So I was getting these mixed messages that, yeah, we're Catholic, but Catholics have done these horrible things and we'll just tiptoe in. We'll sort of, it was a cover. It was a
Yeah.
Catholic cover. And I was only too happy. I wasn't interested in church or sitting there. I would much rather be outside playing or, I was much more interested in football. And so my mother would let me watch, the NFL Today on TV instead of going to church. So
So
that was
the myth was that you were Catholic and you went to church. Tell me then, as you're going to high school, let's skip all the way to high school
Yeah.
now. Is there anything at all that stands out in your memory that you might have had a hint that maybe you were Jewish? And I'm going to double that question with, and then also tell us about your mom and her sister Zoisha in Italy. And at this point in our conversation, because we'll get back to the details later, what's the story that she used as a cover to tell you as to who your aunt was in Italy that she went to visit for months every year? And that sort of combines with, did you ever then put together the possibility that there was some Jewishness here?
Yeah. Well, looking back at the clues,
Yeah.
it's astonishing that neither my sister nor I had a clue that we were Jewish because it was, everything, short of holding up a sign saying, Jewish, we're Jewish. We were the only Catholics on our street that ate matzahs every year for Easter. We were, my father played chess every Thursday night at the Jewish Community Center in town in Schenectady. So, and made no bones about it. It was just, they had the best, the best chess players were at the Jewish Community Center. Their closest friends were Jewish Holocaust survivors. And, they visited friends in New York. And so it was, I would later find out when I was an adult that some of these friends were actually cousins. They were actually related to us. I just didn't know. So on the one hand, there were clues. It was evident that this is with whom they identified strongly, and that our Catholic. What should have tipped me off is that, as I said, we didn't have a clue about being Catholics. I just wasn't aware of that. So my mother and her sister, she had this very, very intense relationship with her older sister Zosha.
Mm-hmm.
And the story that we got as little kids was that my aunt, Sasha, had married before the war an Italian count who was, in fact, as it turns out, he was the only actual Roman Catholic in the entire family. And he was instrumental in helping my mother get out of Eastern Europe, because when her parents were killed by the bomb, she dressed as an Italian soldier and marched out of Poland with the Italian army. And then she was arrested at the border and they thought she was a spy. She was supposed to be killed. But my uncle, this man
Ouch.
Zosha had married, had connections and sent the lawyer to the border and managed to get her, admitted into Italy and sent to a concentration camp. And afterwards, she was able to go and live with them in Rome. My father, in the meantime, was off in Siberia. Everybody assumed he was dead. He had been deported before my parents married. They were engaged to marry before the war. He was deported. No one heard from him. And it took 6 years before he ended up escaping from Siberia, walked across Europe, found my mother in Rome. And then that was the romantic story that we grew up with.
That was the myth.
That was it.
And you bought it. That this
It was a great story.
So, but there was never the word Jewish in there. It was just that they had been in the war and because of who they were, this is what happened. So now let's move along to the beginnings of your discovering the real truth, driven to uncover your roots. What you pieced together in the book is just amazing. It's an astonishing story of Siberian gulags, Italian royalty, and Jewish concentration camps. So tell us where that discovery started and the real story.
Well, it started, I actually started thinking about that perhaps there might be some Jewish blood in our history when I met a woman. This was back in 1990 or so. I met a woman and she started telling me, I told her, just the bare bones, what I knew about this romantic story. My parents are engaged to be married. My father is sent off to Siberia. My mother escapes dressed as an Italian soldier, and they meet and marry 10 years to the day since they first met. That's just the story that I gave. And she, as it turned out, was from a very WASP, blue-blooded New England family. And she had run off at the age of 17 with an Israeli and ran off to Israel and had 2 children. And it wasn't until she was an adult that she found out that her own mother was Jewish. Didn't have anything to do with the Holocaust, but her mother was Jewish and in America, and had hidden that identity from her own father and belonged to the country club that did not allow Jews. So this woman heard my story and she said, I think something doesn't make sense there. If your mother was Catholic, why did she have to dress an Italian soldier to get out of Poland? That doesn't make sense. I bet someone in your family is Jewish. And as soon as she said that, it clicked. I felt that's it. It made immediately, it made sense to me. And I mentioned it to my sister, who's a psychiatrist, and she just said, "Oh, Helen, you have obviously some deep-seated need to make a bigger drama out of your life. No, that's ridiculous. Why would mom and dad lie about something so basic here in America so many years later?" So it was a couple of years later, and my sister was actually doing a fellowship in child psychiatry that as part of her assignment, they had to do a family tree. And that's when she went to my parents, asked for the names of our grandparents. We didn't even know. She was 38 years old, didn't know the names of her grandparents. And she had friends, or I guess her colleagues, told her to send out to the Red Cross and send out to the Mormon church and send out to these genealogy sites. This is before the internet, and to Yad Vashem. Maybe, there were some other relatives that we never even dreamed we were Jewish. We're just trying to find maybe some other relatives. So Yad Vashem, the rabbi at Yad Vashem, did research.
I just want to interrupt that.
Yes.
Yad Vashem is the central authority for Holocaust studies and research in Jerusalem.
Which my sister and I had never heard of.
How old were you at this time?
I was 35 and my sister was 38. So this was
and were you already studying law? Were you?
Oh, I was already practicing law. I was, let me see. I was 35. I had already been practicing law for 7-8 years.
So continue with, you sent out for research at Yad Vashem. And what came back?
We got a packet of documents, and the rabbi just wrote on the top of it a note saying, pages of testimony that were of dozens and dozens of family members that my sister and I had never even known existed, aunts and uncles and cousins, and each page of testimony from survivors were who they were, how they related, where they lived, and how each one, this one was shot in the Tartakover forest. These were starved in the ghetto in Lvov. These were gassed at Belzec on such and such dates. These were, and it was such an overwhelming, in one fell swoop, to receive in the mail all of these documents. And we find out not only are we a little Jewish, there isn't a single non-Jew on either side of the family. And now we find out that we had dozens and dozens, and all of a sudden we went from a family of 4 with one aunt in Italy to literally hundreds of people. And we found out who little children and how each one was killed. So it was overwhelming. And my sister and I then said, how do we approach mom and dad about this? Because our parents were in their late 70s at this point. And my sister, as a psychiatrist, knew this was not a small detail they had omitted from, oh, we forgot to mention we're Jewish. So we went in our separate cities. We consulted various rabbis. I had never talked to a rabbi before knowingly. And then we consulted with psych experts, psychologists, and basically all of the rabbis said the same thing, which is interesting because you can never find 2 rabbis to say the same thing, but everyone said the same thing, which was leave your parents alone. After all they've been through, they've been traumatized. This will just pull the scab off of, just let them live their life. Now you know you're Jewish. This is good. You're still young. You can explore your own Jewish roots. You can do this. You can do that. And all of the psychologists and all of the psychiatrists said exactly the same thing. They said, you have to talk to your parents. They've been carrying this enormous psychic burden. This has been, something that they have repressed and suppressed, most likely for your own benefit. And in order to help them heal, bring them out and allow them to be true, it's an enormous weight, enormous burden and energy suck. So in the end, we decided we'd talk to our parents, just because they're our parents, and we didn't want to keep a secret from them that we knew, that they knew, that it was just too crazy making. So we sat down with them. This was in 1992, and we said that it was really important to us to find out, and we had found out what their roots, what our heritage was. And my mother immediately objected and said, no, 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 no. I told you we're not going to talk about that. And they denied it. Both my father said, well, my father started saying, well, we could tell you this or we could tell you that, and you won't know whether I'm telling the truth or not. So it doesn't matter. And we just said, we have too much evidence. We don't need you to tell us anymore. We already have documents, more than we can possibly absorb. We just want to tell you that we love you. We accept and understand why you kept this. And if you ever feel like you want to talk with us, we'd love to talk with you. We love you, whatever. And this conversation went on for about 3 hours. None of us ever used the word Jewish. We talked about heritage. We talked about our roots. We talked about, neither my sister nor I, nor my parents said this, but we all knew what we were talking about. And finally, at the end, my mother said, well, I've promised my sister I would never speak of this. I've taken a vow, and I don't feel comfortable talking about this unless, let's wait until she comes to visit this summer. And so this summer, my aunt came, my mother, invited us home again. It was the 4th of July. My sister and I came home to upstate New York, and my aunt was there, and my mother pulled us aside and said, you know what, I can't do this. My sister will not be able to handle it. But my mother did honor her promise to us, and we drove out to the shopping mall, of all things. We sat in the food court, and for 4 hours she told us what she said was the true story, which I later found out was not entirely true. But for one thing, she refused to admit, what I later found out, is that they were Orthodox. They were, they were from a small town, they were very poor. Everyone, either you were Jewish or you weren't Jewish, everyone. So her mother had shaved her head and wore a wig. Her father had a beard down here. And when I asked specific questions then of her, asking, did your father have a beard? She said, oh, I don't remember. I don't think so. Maybe he had a mustache. When I asked whether her mother lit candles on Friday, she said, no, we didn't do that. And later I found from relatives and from friends who knew them very well, they were extremely Orthodox. They were.
Did I didn't quite get the answer to this. Did they ever tell you why they were pretending to be Catholic? I mean, probably the audience is saying, well, because they were afraid of anti-Semitism or what. But what was their reason? Was it that? Was it to protect you girls growing up? They felt that you might be attacked as Jews. What was their reason for living this lie?
Well, they had two different reasons. For my father, he had no desire to prevent us from knowing we were Jewish. He had no problem. In fact, he wanted us to know. And when we turned 18, he later told us, when we turned 18, he said, now can we finally tell them? And my mother said, wait, I have to check with my sister in Rome. Her sister said no. So my father respected my mother is the one who needed to keep the secret. For my father, he said, once he set foot in America, he had no qualms whatsoever about being Jewish. He had no fears about it. He was proud to be Jewish. This was not an issue for him. He did it out of respect for my mother, who was traumatized and insisted upon it. Now, when she finally admitted that we were Jewish, she said the reason was that she felt, if you look at Jewish history, every century since the beginning of time has had its own Holocaust. And so she felt that it would have been irresponsible if, having survived the Holocaust, this century's Holocaust herself, she felt either she could resume being Jewish, but then she shouldn't have any children. If she wanted to have children, then she felt morally she needed to protect future generations from what she had gone through. So that was what she told us then, which I later discovered was not entirely true either, because it turned out it wasn't for our, I mean, I think that probably that it was a very clear rationalization for something that she later said what was really, it was my aunt, her sister, who had married this Italian count, that dictated it. And my mother could not bear to lose her sister. And that was the ultimatum that her sister, Zosha, in Rome, gave her. And she said, fine, you want to resume being Jewish? Be my guest, but you're no longer my sister. And that my mother couldn't bear. So
that's very
that's
interesting.
the ultimate.
So what you're saying, to summarize that part of it, is that since your aunt and this Duke uncle, who was not Jewish, and he married your aunt to
Yes.
save her, told your mom that she had to make a choice.
Right.
That if she was going to identify herself and continue being Jewish, she would lose her sister. And so she made that choice.
Mm-hmm.
She would go along. And I do want to talk to you a moment before we get to the ending and some Q&A. There was something that emotionally struck me so closely to you. You talked about how every year your mom would take a few months off and go back to Italy. She had to be with her sister. And in my case, my mother had one remaining sister in Chicago. And from the day we arrived in America, every year, my mother took me out of school. She didn't care if I missed school or not.
Yeah.
And then we went and spent 2 months with my Aunt Bessie in Chicago, because my mother had to be with her Aunt Bessie. Right. And I grew up missing 6 weeks of school every year. that bond and that closeness with the one remaining relative that you may
Yes.
have
Yes.
is, I think, very common to anyone in our audience who's the second generation or even the survivor. So I want to take us to the present.
Mhm.
I want to know how you how you are embracing Judaism now. Are you a practicing Jew? What kind of, if you are, which I think you are,
Yes.
what makes you a practicing Jew? Do you celebrate holidays? Do you like Shabbat candles? Tell us a little bit about your life today after all this discovery and bringing yourself to who you are, the person that Helen Fremont is today, despite living in a family that was definitely traumatized, lies, uh, deceptions. Tell us how you came out of all that to be the smiling, beautiful person you are today.
Well, I definitely have embraced Judaism and feel that that is my true identity. I mean, I think that in fact, when I first found out through the pages of testimony that the rabbi in Yad Vashem sent us, and I found out I was Jewish when I went to friends of mine, said, "Oh my God, sit down! You're not going to believe this. I'm Jewish." Everybody looked at me and said, "Are you kidding? I could have told you didn't know you were Jewish. You talk with your hands, everything about you is Jewish. So, your sense of humor." So I thought that was really interesting that in some ways my identity as a Jew in some very secular way. I mean, these were not Jewish friends assumed I was Jewish. Catholic friends knew I wasn't Catholic and therefore assumed I was Jewish. And so I think I embraced that and originally I wanted to, study Hebrew and Jewish history, and my sister did do that. I mean, she like within 45 minutes she was bat mitzvah. She had already done the entire thing. And I instead got sort of lazy. So I became, I went from being a bad Catholic to being a bad Jew, but I embraced my Jewish identity as opposed to my Catholic, which was just a cover. And I think that my sister joined a temple. I never joined a temple. I mean, I would go. I'm sort of a self-serving Jew in that high holy days. Oh, if I get an invitation, I'll go. If I don't, I'm very I'm a lazy in terms of religious practice Jew. I don't keep kosher kitchen. I mean, in many ways, I was in my mid-30s when I found out I was Jewish, and by that time, I felt a real loss, that I had lost the whole, being able to be raised in that with those associations, in the way that children are sponges and you just absorb it. And I had to study it, and it was like an applied onto me. Whereas my Jewish secular identity comes from within. It just feels that's a part of me.
It's in your soul.
It's in your soul. Yeah.
Uh, Before we go to the questions, and I'm sure there are many, what's your final message as a second generation Holocaust survivor, child of Holocaust survivors, uh, with what you've been through to get to where you are? You're a retired, successful practicing attorney. You live a good life. You live with a partner. You also discovered in your 30s your identity as a gay female. You're a happy person. You have a lovely partner who you take care of. You're her caretaker because she's ill, and we wish her the best. What's your message for those of us who have been through this transmitted trauma of generations of Holocaust survivors in struggling with our identity and who we are and how to live our best lives?
I think the takeaway for me is, and I can't presume to speak for anyone else, because I think everyone has his or her their own issues to deal with. But I really believe everyone is doing the best they possibly can, and I am in awe of my parents. I mean, it was a real freak show to grow up in our family. There were just so many things that were crazy making, but by the same token, when I consider what they've been through, I just am amazed and have enormous admiration for my parents and for my sister and for, I mean, all of us, no matter what our backgrounds or histories, you don't get to become, out of life without having suffered trauma. There is just no way about it. And each of us is trying to, do our best to heal without causing suffering. I don't think that anyone in my family was trying to hurt anyone else. A lot of damage was done, but it was all collateral. I think that is something that I feel very strongly. I have a sense that people genuinely are doing the best that they can.
I really love that. I've come to the terms that all we're all trying to do is just get through the day.
Yeah, yeah, it's true.
So I can't tell you what it's meant to me to get to know you.
And
We've
are
talked before
you? Thank
today.
you.
I feel very close to you, and I bless you and thank you for sharing this very intimate. And there's a lot more that we didn't cover in the book and the previous book that you wrote before that. So I'm going to, at that point, not willingly, because I could go on for the rest
I know,
of the day,
we could chat for a while.
turn it back to Danny and Karen. Hopefully we have about 150 participants for any questions or comments.
Okay. Thank you, Miriam.
So Miriam and Helen, thank you both so much. If anybody does have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A or the chat. And we have a few minutes, and we will get to as many as we can. I do see there already is one question for Helen, if you don't mind answering this one. Why did your aunt's husband make her tell your mom that she had to hide her Judaism? Was he afraid it will be discovered that he helped your mom out?
Well, I don't think that he actually made that request. My uncle, the actual Catholic, was an incredibly docile and sweet and, I dare say, henpecked husband. That Zosha was larger than life. I mean, my aunt was the one who made the decisions for the American family, for those of us the four of us, and also of how things were going to go down in Italy. And my uncle was just the sweetest and kindest and least dictatorial. So, and if he had tried to tell my aunt, I want you to do this, my aunt would have run roughshod over and would have said, I don't care, I'm doing this. Their relationship was not the typical, you think, oh, the man of the family. In fact, I much later found out that their marriage was actually a marriage of convenience for both of them. My aunt was Jewish. Well, I think my uncle was actually gay. And this was a good cover for him. So they lived very separate lives. And it was more my aunt who was in control of the situation. But
all right. Thank you. So we also have, how did Yad Vashem find the family since your parents used fake names? Did you have other names that?
That is a great question. My mother, and we never found survivors from my father's family, actually. But my mother is the one with all these, the explosion of dozens and dozens of relatives. And that's because even though she told us her father's name was Mark, and in fact it was Moisha, and she told us her mother's name was Sophie, and in fact it was Sarah, but she gave the accurate last name. And through that last name, which was an unusual last name, the rabbi was able, and he didn't even have, this was paper documents. He didn't even have it computerized yet. He was able to find pages of testimony based on the actual last name that my mother gave, and also the towns in which they came from. That was also a very important, because they were little shtetls, and that was a giveaway. And as it turned out, my mother's first cousin, who was very close and lived with her before the war and survived himself and came, and as I later found out, was living in Brooklyn the whole time. And my parents got together with them every year, and my sister and I never knew this. This guy, Mendel Goldberg, wrote meticulously in Hebrew, in Yiddish, wrote all of the pages of all of his lost family. And that's how that was what opened the doors.
Well, somebody asked also why, people keep on coming back to your aunt, that you kept being Jewish a secret.
I'm sorry, you broke up, so I didn't quite hear that.
I said, a couple people are asking more questions about your aunt, and why was it that she exerted this influence and wanted the family to not live or not admit that they were Jewish?
Well, that's another really good question, and I didn't understand it until after I published the first book, and my mother stopped speaking to me after that. My aunt didn't even know about the first book, but it was only after, that's where the second book, The Escape Artist, goes into much more detail. I found out there are more secrets, and in fact, my aunt was protecting what Miriam and I didn't talk about is that I have a cousin, my aunt and uncle supposedly had a child an Italian, who was born in 1943, and he was my cousin, and we were kept apart for the most part. He was 13 years older than I am. And what I later figured out is that he's actually my half brother. And so that is what was really driving the secret. And my father didn't know it. So the secrets within the secrets, the two sisters were keeping secret that my aunt raised my mother's child and pretended it to be hers. And now the cousin is a count and a Roman Catholic, and he lives in Italy. So they were protecting his identity from my father. And us.
Okay, so quite a soap opera. All right. Wow. You should write a couple books, maybe make a movie. This is incredible.
Everybody's family's got something,
No, that's true. So we have time for a couple more questions, I hope. But one question I have: when your father was at the JCC playing chess, did others think that he was Jewish, or did he continue to pretend that he was Catholic?
I found out much later that, years later, years after my book came out, that he was known as the Jewish Doctrine town. I don't think he could not lie to save his life, which is precisely what my mother could do. She had to lie to save her life. My father was like, he couldn't even, he couldn't fabricate the slightest thing. So for him to pretend to be anything that he wasn't was so impossible. And so I think he was openly Jewish in his practice as a physician. And
wow.
He was only Catholic to his children.
Helen, I am totally amazed at this amazing story, and I want to thank you for sharing with us. Miriam, do you have any last comments or a question for?
Well, there is one question that I was holding until all the Q&As, and I know people always want to know, how did you choose the title, The Escape Artist?
Oh yeah, that's what my mother, when I was a little kid, my mother always accused me of being an escape artist because, and that was a derogatory, you know, I was the one who was disloyal. I had friends. I wanted to do stuff with other people outside the family. And we were such an insular cult that my mother, and this is probably true for many people who were survivors, the idea that, you know, if you could not trust anyone, this was drilled into us too, you cannot trust anyone but family, only blood ties you trust. And I was like, I want to go out and do stuff with my friends, and that was considered disloyal. So my mother always said, you're just a little escape artist, you're always trying to get away from the family. And she wouldn't let me go out with friends on Saturday. The weekends were for family, the evenings were for family. And so I realized that, in fact, it was my mother who could not forgive herself for escaping. Her parents died, and I think that was one of the biggest traumas of her life. And she would collapse at often and say, I should have died with my parents. So I think her survivor guilt at having escaped, having survived, and then to see her own daughter doing that same sort of, I'm getting out of here, I'm going to just go do my own thing, was very, very upsetting for her.
I think finally, the last thoughts that I've had reading the book, working with you, being a child survivor and listening to the stories I heard my parents, is that I think we have to really seriously think about forgiveness in our lives.
Mm,
I'm not talking about Nazi forgiveness. I do
Mm.
not forgive Nazis, period. But about our interrelationship forgiveness. Our parents do things that just seem terrible. But let's think about why.
mm-hmm.
And you've done that. You recognize that what they did was, beyond. But you have forgiven them and you have brought up your love for their trying to protect and for whatever reasons they had. And I think that's the message we should leave with this talk today, is about our forgiveness with our interrelationships, whether it be,
Absolutely.
with our friends, with our partners, with our children. So that would be my final thought on it.
Yeah, that's lovely. I agree.
All right, well, Helen Fremont, the book is The Escape Artist, so I'm sure it's available on Amazon and other places. If anybody,
I actually just put it in the chat. Always supporting Books and Books, our local bookstore. So I did put a link in there.
Oh,
okay.
wonderful.
Purchase it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karen,
Perfect.
for being a super partner with
Yeah.
our Holocaust
Thank you.
Education Week.
Karen, thank you so much.
And Helen, keep in touch.
Oh,
Keep in touch.
absolutely. I'm going to watch your own story on
Friday
Friday.
morning. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
I'm looking
please
forward to
do.
that.
Please do.
Thank
So,
And,
thank you.
Somebody in the
Wonderful.
chat asked if this is being recorded. This is, and we will try and make it safely available to people who didn't get a chance to watch it all or weren't able to sign in as well. So Miriam, thank you so much for doing this, being the moderator for this program. And Helen, once again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Karen and the Miami Beach JCC as well. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Have a good
Bye,
afternoon.
everybody.
Bye. Thank you.